Okay, Dr. S, we are on. You can share.
Okay. Good. Good, here we go. Yes, good evening. We're going to first go through a little PowerPoint, and then the floor is open for questions or remarks or objections. Okay. I hope I'm duly visible and audible.
Yes, all good.
All right. Yes. Okay. Yes. So we're going to talk about the book, the Calcutta Quran Petition. It's the occasion on which it, for which it was written, and what is in it. It's a very important statement by Goelji, though little remarked. So, the occasion why he wrote the book are the following facts. In 1984, a citizen of West Bengal, Himanshu Kishore Chakravorty, addressed a letter to the Home Secretary of West Bengal, pointing out that Section 295A and Section 153A were violated by the Quran on the grounds that it promotes disharmony, feeling of enmity, hatred, and ill will between different religious communities, and insults other religions or religious beliefs of other communities in India. Those are, there he uses the terms that the law itself uses. So what he wants to say is that clearly the Quran itself is in contravention of this law. And so if other books have been banned on that ground, then the Quran must also be banned. He got no answer. He sent the letter again. He got no answer. And so because of this, a friend of his, Chanmal Chopra, a Jain, filed a writ petition at the Kolkata High Court. So he made the same arguments, which to a court of law ought to be compelling. And so Chanmal Chopra observed that the Muslims, at least, had a history of banning publications, namely those critical of Islam. And this goes back to the beginning of Islam, and in Christianity, it goes back even farther, also to its beginning. So far, it has been the privilege of the peoples of the book to ban and burn the sacred literature of the pagans. I remark in passing that the term peoples of the book, which has become common, is in fact a strictly Islamic term, which the other so-called peoples of the book don't accept. You see, Christians argue that the God of the Quran is clearly not the same one as the God of the Bible. And it's only Islam that claims that this is the same God, that Muhammad stands in the line of the biblical prophets. So it is a big concession to Islam already to use the term peoples of the book. But this has been common. Many of the things that are even argued by Hindu activists who question Islam or who question Christianity nonetheless have interiorized quite a bit of Islamic or Christian terminology. Now, this is a fact of history. Hindus have never burned books, have never persecuted those of other religions, have given asylum to those of other religions, Christians, Parsis, Tibetan Buddhists. Now, since 1927, however, this is not just a historical fact, but a repeat of it in a modern form has become the law of the land in British India. And I like to explain how that came about. This law dates back to 1927, a special year because the trial of the assassin of Swami Shraddhananda took place. Swami Shraddhananda was an Arya Samaj activist who especially devoted himself to reconversion, to bringing Muslim volunteers, Muslims who wanted to do so, you see, bringing them back to Hinduism. This was a campaign that was called Shuddhi, purification. Nowadays, they speak of Ghar Wapasi, homecoming, but the idea is the same, especially from the Islamic viewpoint. It means that Muslims are brought to apostasy, to leaving Islam. So Swami Shraddhananda was murdered in 1926. The assassin was apprehended, and so his trial took place in 1927. He was duly sentenced, and by the customs of those days, he was sentenced to death, and his death sentence was executed. However, you see, this might seem to say that the British authorities sided with the victim and gave the assassin his due, but they also decided this time around to take action against the party of the victim, and so this was because the problem of Islam critical persons, especially the Arya Samaj in those days. So a number of them had been killed already. This started with the then leader of the Arya Samaj, Pandit Lekram, in 1897. And so that year too, they felt the heat, they felt the seriousness of the problem when another Arya Samaj writer was also assassinated. This was Mahashai Rajpal for his book Rangila Rasul. The term Rangila literally means colorful, but it means, you see, somebody about whom stories can be told, a colorful person, in particular a fornicator, one who has a very colorful sex life. And to say this about the Rasul, that is to say the prophet, meant that he was lampooning the prophet's sex life, also showing very moralistically that he did not live up to norms of chastity and so on, and that therefore by Hindu standards, he could not be a very spiritual person. Anyway, so the Muslim masses didn't like it. This can be compared to the satanic verses in 1988-89 by Salman Rushdie, the British writer of Indian origin. He had, part of the story, not the only reason why Muslims were angry, but it certainly spoke to the imagination of the masses. That's what got them going, not the theologians so much, is that he has a scene in a brothel where the women who work there take a sort of artist's name, namely the names of all the wives of the prophets. So you could go in and make love to Khadija or to Aisha or to Zainab, each of his wives. And they usually were like specialized in certain certain sexual techniques, and so you could go around and say, oh yeah, you see, I did it with Khadija, and we did this and this, and so on. So I mean, it's well, it's quite juicy, and unlike what Rushdie had explicitly written, the story went around that he has portrayed the wives of the prophets as prostitutes. And so this absolutely scandalized the Muslims. And so they were protesting, you see, we must kill Salman Rushdie. Well, here they did come around to killing, so they killed Rajpal. And so the British rulers thought, well, you see, this is getting out of hand. And so they had enough of it, and they decided to do something about it. So the existing law 295, which was a law against slander and libel and so on, was expanded, and an annexie was added to it. And so what they were going to do was not so much to punish assassination. That law already existed, of course. They were not going to do something against the Muslim intolerance of criticism, which had been the cause of all this, and which was the self-styled motive of each of these assassins. You know, you see the problem nowadays too. Whenever Muslims commit acts of terrorism, immediately the politicians and the media rally to the Muslim cause and start arguing, no, this had nothing to do with Islam. Muslims are the first victims, in fact. So then it was more or less the same thing, not on such a massive scale, but the people who really decided reasoned like this, you see, not so much the Muslim intolerance is the problem, but the fact itself that there was a public questioning of their religion. Now, in England, this was perfectly normal to discuss religion, and there were plenty of arguments between the Anglicans and the Puritans and the Catholics and so on. This was a perfectly normal thing to you know, talk religion and argue against the religion, one or another religion. But the British thought, well, okay, that's us. We are grown-ups. You see, we are capable of you know, new experiments in history, like democracy. That's also not a usual thing, but we have evolved to the stage where we can have a democracy, where we can allow commoners a certain say in public affairs. This is not fit for lower class people like Indians. And indeed, you see, this is a sort of progressive form of racism that has prevailed in the 19th and early 20th century. The idea that the Indians, for example, were like children who needed a strong hand, you see, a strict father to order their lives, that otherwise they would make a mess of it. Like, for instance, in the Second World War, or before that, Churchill said of the Italians, who are like the Indians of Europe, you know, who are treated as very disorganized, chaotic, but also very religious and so on. The stereotype with Indians is quite precise, in fact. Some of them, Churchill said, well, you see, for those people, perhaps it is better to have a dictator like Mussolini at the time. Whereas for us, for the English-speaking peoples, we have arrived at the stage of having democracy. And so similarly, we have arrived at the stage of having public debates, whereas Indians are deemed far too excitable, too emotional, too irrational, to get away with this kind of debate. Anyway, so that's how they justified it to themselves. They didn't need to do much justifying to the Indians. And so they enacted this law, which prohibits criticism of religions. The law was meant for Islam only. It was cast in modern terms, where it did not say you can't blaspheme Allah or Muhammad. It was cast in neutral terms. You can't insult religious figures in general, but in practice, it only was meant to protect Islam and to prevent Muslims from getting intolerant and violent because of it. Because Hindus didn't do such things, or much less. So the Islamic system is still prevalent in Pakistan, very strongly at the moment, where every slight against Islam or the Prophet is prosecuted. You see, this was enacted by the British in secular terminology, but with the same effect. Oh yeah, maybe I can tell you that in 2014, there were some petitions, not legal petitions, but just, opinion-forming petitions by a number of Western Indologists as well as Indian academics against Article 295A. And this is strange because usually all those busybodies support Indian Muslims against Hindus. And so they would normally support this law if a Hindu comes out and does what here Chanmal Chopra did and point out the violent nature, the intolerant nature of the Quran, then they would rally around the Muslims and argue that, oh yeah, the overbearing majoritarian Hindus are at it again. Look how intolerant they are towards Muslims and so on. Well, in this case, they didn't do so. You see, they said, no, you see, a free India has to do without Article 295A. This banning of books should be abolished. Why? Because the occasion was then, and this is 2014, that a Hindu, Dinanath Batra, had brought to court a book on Hinduism written by Wendy Doniger. And so that book attacked Hinduism or misrepresented Hinduism, insulted Hinduism. And though there are very many such books around, this one somehow got the attention of one Hindu who did bring it to court and who then did apply this Article 295A against the usual suspects. And so suddenly all the Indologists were motivated to demand the scrapping of Article 295A. So this was very interesting. Apparently, they didn't know the origin of this article and the fact that the article is mostly used to muzzle Hindus rather than their critics. Anyway, so you see, yes, after Julie. Please unmute yourselves. Okay, so considering this law article, they should have the judges should have considered whether this book was really in contravention of it, but it never got to that point. So immediately it was very clear that all political circles would exercise enormous pressure on the judges not to even entertain the petition. Now the petition was first allowed, and so a trial about the contents of the Quran originally was meant to take place, but it never got that far. The affidavit entered by the government said that the Holy Quran is a divine book and no earthly power can sit in judgment on it. That, of course, is also in deference to the Islamic belief that the Quran is, first of all, holy, that the Quran is a divine book. You see, it's no business of a secular government to say such things. But anyway, this is the argument they used, that, you know, exactly like Muslims themselves say, the Quran is totally beyond the judgment by any earthly power, by any human being. Then on the streets, of course, the Muslim community made clear its opposition to any kind of questioning of the Quran. There were a number of riots. At least 12 Hindus were killed. This was in a village on the border of India and Bangladesh. And so ultimately the judge did decide not to entertain the petition. And so he dismissed the petition on the 7th of May, 1985. There was punitive action threatened against the petitioners. Chanmal Chopra had indeed been joined by a second petitioner. And also against the judge, who had dared to even entertain the petition. You see, ultimately it was dismissed, but for a few weeks, the possibility existed that the judge would not dismiss it. And so even that was already going too far. So Sitaram Goel wrote a book about it. Initially, it was not much more than simply documentation for posterity of the whole case. So the petition itself, all the letters written about it, the verdicts about it, and so on, they were simply brought together into a book, and that was the book. But in successive reprints, Goelji added an introduction which became longer. And so it is that introduction which is important for our purposes. So he observes, for instance, that Muslims have often Sorry, could you please unmute yourselves? There's a lot of interference here, of noise. Okay, so Muslims have often sought shelter under sections 153A, it should say, and 295A for preventing every public discussion of their creed. This here, Chanmal Chopra's petition, was the first time that a pagan had questioned the character of a document hailed as the very word of God by a people of the book. It must be said that apart from Muslims, Christians had also discovered the power of this law to ban books, like, for instance, the work of fiction, the Da Vinci Code was banned also at the Christian demand. Hindus had not gotten around to doing that. So here is the first time they tried. So I mentioned later the case of Wendy Doniger's book. That's, of course, not a divine book. I guess nobody claims that as the word of God. But it was an anti-Hindu book. It was a book very offensive to Hinduism. And so some Hindus thought that it was the wisest thing to also try to ban the book. I think it was a very unwise course. It only drew attention to the book, which sold even more. In a modern age also, book banning is so silly because everybody gets interested in a book that has the status of being banned. And anyway, through the internet now, you can spread books any amount you want. So it was just, I think it was a bad move. Anyway, because of the book that Goelji wrote, in which, of course, Chopra was present very much. He was arrested and he spent 9 days in prison. Goelji was also sought to be arrested, but he absconded. He knew this, this situation already from the past, like during the emergency in 1975 also, the Indira Gandhi wanted to arrest him and he absconded successfully. Anyway, so they were let off in the end. In the last edition in 1999, that's this edition, if you can see it. You see, this is already a big book because the actual contents of the book is only a small thing compared to the introduction, which is the main part of the book now. And so there he lists more testimonies of jihad. You see, as a simple introduction to the history of Islam, it is already a very, very good book, very useful. But he also looks into the type of consciousness that becomes prophecy, that produces so-called revelations. And so there he goes to the medieval testimony of Minhaj Siraj, a Muslim historian, about a non-Muslim, though many Muslims believe he was a Muslim because of the name Khan, Genghis Khan. And so Khan has become a very common Pakistani name. And so many Muslims think that Khan means Muslim, which in fact is a Turkish title, a chieftain. And at that time, the Turks and the Mongols were not yet Muslims. So Minhaj Siraj describes how Genghis Khan had revelations and acted upon them. Look, after every few days, he would have a fit, and during his unconsciousness, he would say all sorts of things. It was like this. When he had his first fit, and the Satans, the devils, after overpowering his mind, informed him of his forthcoming victory. Then he put the clothes and the cloak he was then wearing in his sealed bag and carried it about with him. So this is the sort of superstitious belief that these clothes and so on had been like charged with the presence of these spirits and gave power. Whenever this fit was about to overpower him, he would put on these clothes and talk about every event, victory, campaign, the appearance of his enemies, and the conquest of the territories he wanted. Someone would write down all he said, put the papers in a bag, and seal them. Then when Genghis recovered consciousness, everything was read out to him, and he acted accordingly. Generally, in fact, always, his designs were successful. Now that's more or less the story of Muhammad's prophecy too. You see, he too would roll on the floor, foaming at the mouth and so on, get into a trance state. Then a secretary, originally the secretary of the trade company of his wife, so she had personnel, and so this included the secretary. And so he would write down everything that Muhammad said. And then later on, you see, this verse will first of all be communicated to Muhammad himself and be communicated to others as part of the divine revelation or the Quran. So if all the sayings of Genghis Khan, or as the belief may be, all the sayings by the spirits to Genghis Khan. If they had been written down and then collected and turned into a book, then that would be some sort of second Quran. And it would be interesting to see how these different sacred books would have clashed. But at any rate, the type of consciousness that animated Genghis Khan is also what animated Muhammad. The similarities are just too striking to be missed. So it is not very often in Hindu history that that kind of critical assessment of the basis of other religions is tried. In fact, I don't know of any case in the whole of Hindu history except for Swami Vivekananda. Vivekananda has some sayings in favor of Muhammad and in favor of Islam, and those are always quoted. But he also is very critical about the Prophet, and so he makes this diagnosis that Muhammad had very irrational states of consciousness, which passed as prophecy. And he attributes it to the effect of meditation gone bad. You see, indeed, both in India, also in China, whenever you practice this, you embark upon a meditative path, you get told, you get warned by your guru, you have to follow the rules, you have to observe certain purifications and so on. Otherwise, this technique is dangerous. And so Vivekananda said, well, you see, maybe because of a lack of proper guidance, Muhammad went wrong, you see, tried meditation, but didn't do it well. And so these are the effects. Now he suffered hallucinations. Meanwhile, there are a few Western psychologists, psychiatrists who have said, well, perhaps, you see, it's not this, perhaps it is something that he had since childhood. And so there are some strange stories in the Hadith of Muhammad as a child behaving strangely. And at one point, he was an orphan. At one point, he was taken care of by a family in the countryside. And they returned him to his family in the city because they didn't want the responsibility for him clearly becoming a strange character. And so maybe this had something to do with it, maybe not. First of all, the history of this, this is always doubtful how reliable these stories are. And even if correct, it's not very sure that this strange behavior in childhood has something to do with his behavior, with his trance, with his hallucinations later on. Anyway, but so there is an awareness among not Hindus in general, but a few Hindus that there is something strange about the consciousness that translates towards believers as prophecy. So this may be looked into further, analyzed further, more data collected and so on. That's all very fine, but the breakthrough towards that approach, that critical, independent-minded approach, that is the privilege of some very few people. Swami Vivekananda, I had almost forgotten Ram Swarup, of course. Ram Swarup also writes about this, about how higher states of consciousness can go wrong. And then, of course, applying it to the prophets. And so here, Sita and Goel. And I think that is really the most important contribution of this book. So going to court and demanding the scrapping of the Quran, that's a little bit bizarre, especially knowing the context of Indian politics and minority appeasement and so on, it is very unlikely that the government would allow such, well, anything that provokes such a crisis of self-doubt in Muslims. And the idea, of course, also of banning a book is very bizarre. And so, in fact, as Goel himself clarified, you know, because after all, he had written about a petition demanding a ban on the Quran. He said, well, we do not stand for a ban of the publication of the Quran. You know, it's meant to draw attention to the contents of the Quran. But then the Quran should not be banned. On the contrary, everybody should read it critically. So Goel said, we take this opportunity to state unambiguously that we regard banning of books, religious or otherwise, as counterproductive. In the case of the Quran, we believe and advocate that more and more non-Muslims should read it so that they know firsthand the quality of its teachings. And that indeed is the right approach. You see, I see on social media and other forums, many Hindus say, oh yeah, freedom of speech, you know, all right, but that doesn't mean you can insult Hinduism. Well, if it doesn't mean that, you see, it doesn't mean much. And so great champions of freedom of speech, like George Orwell, for example, have emphasized that. You see, freedom of speech means the freedom to say things that people don't like. Now, some Hindus will say, but then are you saying that, you know, you can spend your time insulting the Hindu gods? And well, that's not necessarily what I mean. You see, you may very well dislike insults. I mean, it's normal that you would. But, you know, civil society can act against that. You can tell people, you see, we don't like this. Are you sure you want to insult us like this? There have been cases like, you know, where companies designed underwear with pictures of Hanuman on it, for example, or designed toilets with Hindu gods worked into it or so. Very insulting indeed. But then Hindus have protested. And of course, the Hindus too are consumers, are buyers. And also what they say, so any commotion that they raise has an influence on other buyers. And so the companies themselves said, well, you see, this is not worth it. And so they withdrew those products. So just by the force of persuasion, you can achieve a lot. There's absolutely no reason to bring in the law and to ban these offensive things. So you see, Goel had thought about these things, who had experience, a lot of experience with what freedom of expression can do. He emphasized that he was in favor of unfettered freedom of expression. I think that is the correct position. And so in this case, very clearly, there are very many books already around that do insult Hinduism, that do culpabilize Hindus, that you see, blame Hinduism for all kinds of social evils. Those books are around anyway. They're just too numerous to try banning each of them, even if you would want that. And so Hinduism still survives in spite of all these publications. But, you know, they do not touch the essence of Hinduism. That, of course, you could say, well, all those people attack Hinduism where it is not, or where it is, you know, I mean, you can't deny that, for instance, the much maligned caste system has existed in Hinduism for some 2,000, 2,500 years. And so that criticism to some extent can even be fair. But you see, Hinduism will survive even without castes. It didn't have castes in the very distant past. in many corners of society, it is caste-free today. Like many diaspora communities of Hindus are still very much Hindu, still have mandirs, still have the unending reading of the Ramayana, whatever, Hindu practices there are. And yet they don't have caste anymore, like the Hindu community in the Netherlands, for instance. So you see, those things that are being attacked in the case of Hinduism are not essential. Whereas here, it's hard to imagine an Islam that does away with revelation, with prophethood, that says, well, you see, these verses of Muhammad, they were not dictated to him by a supreme being. They were just, his own mind, his own subconscious rattling on. That really goes to the heart of Islam. And so in Islam, you have many things that simply are religion in general, like the practice of fasting. You see, they fast for 1 month, but you see, most religions have fasting. Hinduism has fasting, fasting on the 11th of the month, for example. Judaism does fasting on certain holidays, Day of Atonement, for instance, just recently. Christianity has the 40 days of Lent. So you see, let Muslims do that, you see. Going on pilgrimage. You see, Christians go on pilgrimage, Hindus go on pilgrimage. Well, you see, yes, Muslims go on pilgrimage. There's nothing wrong with that. That pilgrimage also existed before Islam. Islam just usurped that pilgrimage for its own ends, but the pilgrimage already existed. Now, many Muslims take a certain pride in their practices, in the rules they follow. About that, there's really nothing wrong about those. They will evolve once they are not Muslims anymore, but there will be still some variations of those practices. And why not? You see, that's not the problem. The problem with Islam is Muhammad. And in fact, it's the only original thing about Islam. You see, everything already existed, both the good things and the bad things. The original thing about Islam is the person of Muhammad, the veneration for Muhammad. And so the belief that Muhammad was the spokesman of God, the ultimate spokesman, the seal of the prophets. Now that, you see, that will not withstand this critical inspection. And so today, you see, it has become a rather important to develop that critical look, because if you want to defend yourselves peacefully against Islam, and many Hindus resent Islam as a force of aggression, as a danger to Hinduism, as a threat, well, you see, you are not going to counter that threat with their own methods, with terrorism, with violence, with overbearing majoritarianism, which is always imputed to the Hindus. But you may get very far by taking a closer look into Islam. And so many Muslims who understand that outsiders, that non-Muslims have seen through Islam. You see, they will first become defensive, and ultimately they themselves will take a second look at their beliefs and gradually grow away from them. You see, this is what I personally have seen happening in the case of Christianity. My own generation almost collectively walked out of church. Today, many churches in Belgium are being closed down because nobody goes there anymore. So the more, you see, artful, the richer ones are being preserved, are turned into effectively museums. And you see the more modern ones, less special architecturally and so on, they are turned into swimming pools or restaurants or whatever. Some are turned into mosques, I have to add. But so at any rate, in Western Europe, at least, Christianity is almost a thing of the past. And that's not because of oppression, of persecution, and so on. Nothing of the sort was needed. Just people saw through it. You know, with the democratization of education, of the scientific temper, people just took a second look at it and thought, well, you know, this is not something I can still believe in. Maybe religion still has a place in my life, maybe fasting and pilgrimage and so on still do something. But this belief that, you see, Jesus is the Son of God, that he was resurrected and so on, that I can't believe anymore. So similarly, a stage may come where Muslims themselves take a second look at their beliefs and decide, well, you see, believing in revelation, believing that Muhammad was the spokesman of God, you see, that I can't accept anymore. Maybe some of the commandments of Islam and so on are still valid, maybe they are, but this basic belief, this defining belief, you know, that is not sustainable. Whereas in Hinduism, you can have criticism of certain Hindu practices, and maybe some of them should, you know, deserve to go. Like, I mean, the famous example, of course, is sati. Sati is not really a Hindu practice. In fact, the very first time that the Vedas, in fact, mention it, it is a description of sati where the woman who wants to commit sati, who climbs the pyre of her husband, is dissuaded from practicing sati. So sati is not really a Hindu practice. The Shastras, you see the Manusmriti, the much maligned Manusmriti, don't mention it. But yes, it happened, you know, and so it was a good thing that this was stopped. And so here and there, maybe something in Hinduism has to evolve, and why not? But so that's all, that leaves Hinduism intact, essentially. But whereas in the case of Islam, well, you see, we have a little challenge on our hands. But so addressing this challenge starts with, first of all, being honest about the facts. And so in that respect, the Calcutta Quran petition was a healthy step. So I thank you with this, and I hope there's a lot of interesting discussion following. You now all have the floor.
That has become done.
Yeah.
So that,
Okay. Anyone has questions?
come back and send it fine. I think it's been a long day for you.
Well, in
Yes,
that
if anyone
case,
has questions? Yeah.
let me first of all point out that there's a related publication by Goel, Freedom of Expression, is a book which he edited. He himself has also written parts of it, but it's also articles by others like Arun Shauri, for example, who write against what Goel calls on that occasion the emergency that Islam has imposed on India. Here the occasion was the attempt to ban a book by Ram Swarup, which didn't succeed, fortunately. And that it didn't succeed is largely thanks to the publicity that was immediately given Syed Shahabuddin, a Muslim politician, made attempts to have this book banned. And immediately there were protests and long write-ups by Arun Shourie, who told, people to actually go read the book, the supposedly offensive book, and form their own opinion about it. But so it's an argument in favor of freedom of expression. I noticed that many Hindus take a very skeptical view of freedom of expression, lump it in with all the secularist borrowings from the West, and that they think is evil and so on. Well, practice teaches that it is the Hindus who profit most from freedom of expression. And so they should keep it, they should preserve it, they should passionately defend it. And that's what Goelji did.
Namaste, Kornatji.
Yes.
I unfortunately couldn't attend the beginning of your talk, but I heard a little bit. My question on based on what I heard is in the concluding slides, you mentioned especially a case in Belgium as a European case where churches are being shuttered.
Yes.
And some, and mainly because of education and awareness and knowledge, and people become wiser in one way. Another way to rephrasing that, not as gullible, and some are becoming mosques. So these are like contradictory there, right? How come the society is on one hand are growing wiser?
It's not the people who have left the church who are now going to the mosque.
Yeah.
There are a few, in the case of marriage, there are people who marry Muslims and then very silly they convert to Islam. But it's not really those people who turn churches into mosques. So this is just a matter of influx of Muslim population. It's mass immigration. And so, yes, Muslims do turn churches into mosques, and that's of course always a great victory for them. They're very proud of it. It means conquering enemy territory.
I know.
Gonerji,
I wanted to draw the irony out there. Yeah.
Can I add to that? Like I'm in the US, and in some communities, Hindu nonprofits have bought churches, defunct churches, and have converted that into temples. To your point, Dr. Anas, is the same thing. Yeah.
Very good.
Gonerji, this is Ravinder here. May I ask a question, please?
Yes.
This question is slightly related to what you were just talking about, but it is deeply related to that, because you recommended that the freedom of speech is sacrosanct. So I have a little bit of more of a philosophical type of question. Why is freedom of speech sacrosanct and freedom of action is not equally sacrosanct?
Well, I guess the English proverb, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me.
But that I think is, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, really. You see, there is a big difference between words and acts, especially acts of violence. You see, the candidate censors, or what is nowadays called cancel culture, they are very good at equating words with acts. For instance, a now very common term, hate speech. You see, hate speech, that term, those who use that term, they tend to equate speech with acts. They say people suffer because of speech. You see, people are hurt by speech. They use all these metaphors from the battlefield for speech. Now, you see, that I think is a category mistake. That is lack of a power of discrimination. You can insult people and that does them nothing. You know, of course, in a polite society, you don't insult people. But, you know, even if you do, that is still very different from killing him. So, yes, it is perfectly normal to make that distinction, that in the realm of words, many things are possible, are allowed, whereas in the realm of acts, there are rather strict rules. Certain limits cannot be crossed.
But if you look at the corresponding people, I'm sorry, I'm persisting on that, but I'm being a devil's advocate. It is well known that that even, for example, in India, for example, the subjugation, which may not have been necessarily the physical subjugation alone, but the humiliation which one can go through the speech, through or for example, the recent case of the Oxford or Cambridge University, that lady who was chosen as a president from India. She was chosen president, and it was purely the speech issues which actually broke her entirely. And so in that sense, no less damaging actually. And such humiliations can be actually incorporated into the very genetic structure and passed on to the future generation, which are traumatic aspects. So therefore, my question is, why is that any less harmful than the corresponding so there must be certain levels of speech where it is very harmful and equally harmful, where as the action, bodily action by people. So why shouldn't there be a structure on that?
Well, you see, the general Hindu bashing that has been going on for decades, that is really a problem that should be addressed. But still, treating it like physical violence, on a par with physical violence, is a mistake. You see, I know about the case you are mentioning. So this Hindu student representative in Oxford University.
Yeah.
She was attacked for being a Hindu. She hadn't done anything wrong. Just being a Hindu was too much for them. Of course, you know, all these leftist students were all for, you know, ethnic minorities taking positions and so on. Only not Hindus, which has to do with the fact that Hindus are not really considered a minority. Not even where they are, like in England. You see, if I may put it in American racial terms, Hindus are the whites of India. That is to say, nowadays there's no longer a premium on being white. No, there are all kinds of attacks on whites. And so some Hindus, some silly Hindus think, oh yeah, let's get on the bandwagon. Let's also get woke. But you see all these others, all these anti-Hindus, including Hindu-born communists and so on, in America as well as in India, they see Hindus in the same position as whites in America. Namely, they are the overbearing majority and so on. They enjoy historical privileges, which incidentally is of course not true. In all the centuries of Islamic oppression and Christian oppression, the shoe was on the other foot. And there was a premium on being a Muslim, respectively being a Christian. And it was a disadvantage to be Hindu. If there are religious reservations in India, then the principle ought to be that the historical victims, namely the Hindus, ought to be privileged and not the minorities, as is the case now. So anyway, this observation that Hindus are the ones who have been oppressed and not Muslims, that is lost on the outside world. Yeah, you see, all the media people, all the academics in the West and so on, they love to treat Muslims as a victim community, both in the West and in India. And therefore, the natives in the West, they are the bad guys, And the natives in India, they too are the bad guys. And this is also where the Aryan invasion comes in. Hindus would like to say, but we are the indigenous people and so on. Well, they are not even that. You see, they too are invaders, colonizers, even though 4,000 years ago, but still somehow through the caste system, especially, that still works on, because many people believe that the caste system is a sort of racial apartheid system, which it is not historically, but okay. Anyway, so the perception of Hindus is not at all that they are some poor, hapless minority that has to be treated with kid gloves. No, on the contrary, they are seen as the aggressors. And so all the modern talk about Hindu fascism and so on, that comes in handy. You see, that adds to this general picture of Hindus as oppressors. And so Hindus have a big job to do to make clear to the rest of the world that the situation is totally different.
But in that sense, you are justifying the ignorance of others to basically damage a whole lock, stock, and barrel, whole communities. Or
I am not justifying anything. I am
No,
describing.
Yeah. But that description, therefore, cannot be used as a justification, and therefore it is hurting. The end point is that it does hurt Hindus in different conditions, and therefore why should there not be a structure on such speech or such statements?
Well, I mean, I have suffered numerous insults, and I don't know, I've only grown by that. You know, of course, I felt hurt when I was young and vulnerable and susceptible to those things. Yes, I felt hurt, but I mean,
but India's rejection of its past in India itself, by Nehru's and others, etc., is a consequence of that inferiority which was inculcated, and therefore self-destruction mode which they went on. It's a consequence of that speech. Therefore not a small issue. So why should there not be structure on such damaging speeches?
Well, because you know where you start and not where you end. You see, if you start prohibiting these, insults against her, well, you know, where does this end?
Oh, I can tell you where it ends.
No, this is very typical, you see. People start clamoring for some dictatorship or so, as long as they themselves are on the winning side. But you see, these laws are going to be turned against you once the power equation changes. So no, you see, I'm just for fairness. There should be freedom of speech for all parties concerned. And yes, you see, I mean, all the problems that like this particular student faced, that Hindus in general face, you know, there can be, something can be done about them. And, you know, in the past, people staked their lives. You see, fought battles for centuries on end, Shivaji and Bajirao and so on. They sacrificed enormously. You see, what modern Hindus have to go through, you see some speech that they don't like. I mean, that's nothing.
Yeah, but what my example would be Jews, for example. Finally, they were demonized by this speech, by whatever was written about them.
Yeah,
and it became easy to create what's called genocide of the Jews, or Holocaust of the Jews. But to start with, this demonization and justification came from the speech, and therefore there is a problem there. If you say it is not like the physical using of physical force, but there is a problem there. Therefore, it cannot be justified that the speech is harmless. It is not harmless.
Yeah, I think
okay.
we can acknowledge that negative speech, and as Konradji already mentioned, there's a big work ahead to rectify that speech. the historical.
Exactly. It's not
incorrect.
like
We
you
already-
have to just let it happen. You can react to speech with
counter it.
speech, not with
Yes.
laws. You see, nobody said that freedom is easy. You know, it's not like you can go on a holiday and expect freedom to continue behind you. No, you see, once in a while as citizens, we have to take our responsibility and stand up for freedom. So you have to answer speech with speech. You know, when there ever a book is published that you don't like, well, write a better book against it.
No, as Rajiv Malhotra has pointed out, there's a asymmetry of the power in publishing.
Yes, that's true.
So right. So therefore, what I'm saying is that the first justification of not using the physical power was that it can be damaging. But similarly, there is a level of speech in particular when you do against the whole communities, where this speech can be highly damaging. It can go through the Holocaust or what happened in Rwanda, those kind of things, all because of certain propaganda which was created. And this creating such a hate there should be a structure on that.
So let me intervene here because we are running out of time and it's 4 a.m. in Belgium. So the series is the focus of the series is what was Sitaramji's position on it. Now there could be further debate, and Ravinderji has a valid point. Conradji is also making a very good point. But Dr. Elst, can you just summarize what Sitaram Goel thought on this? I think you have already said, but let's end the discussion on that note.
Well, he was clearly in favor of freedom of expression. Back then and also today, the idea of protecting Hinduism through banning certain forms of speech, first of all, was totally unrealistic. You see, they would make that kind of concession to Muslims, as the British in 1927 did, and not to Hindus. And so Hindus can stand up for that. But I mean, I think there are better things to stand up for. And I mean, anyway, what I think of it is not important. You see, Sitaram Goel clearly threw his weight on the side of freedom of speech. And so freedom of speech by its very nature is unfettered. You know, those who say, yeah, freedom of speech, but this does not mean that Hindus can be insulted, or respectively Muslims can be insulted, and that religion, that gods can be insulted. Well, you see, if you stop at a certain point, then you can ban any speech. And indeed, you see, we see this, happening. We see how from, for example, Maoism, which started as a strong regime, as a repressive regime in 1947, went, to even greater heights of repression in the Cultural Revolution 20 years later, where anything you could say could be used against you. If you were on the wrong side of the power struggle, then any words could be deemed crimes. And indeed, you see the example of the Cultural Revolution. Well, you see, that's a good example against the argument that we've just heard, namely that, you see, there the opposite happened. Words could be treated as crimes. Words were not the cause of crimes, but they were the cause of criminalization, of being treated as a criminal. And so anyway, to answer your question, you see, Sitaram Goel was clearly on the side of freedom of speech. Hinduism is not hurt by freedom of speech. You see, Hinduism doesn't have anything to hide. It can win debates, whereas claims of Muhammad being the prophet or Jesus being resurrected and so on, those are claims that won't stand up to the light of day.
Right. And, just to cap it, that point, that state repression to be used for, a certain objective, depending on, like you said, whoever has the power will exercise that state repression. and how far that will go, we don't know. Like, what are the repercussions of it? So let's end that there. I mean, we can invite further commentary or even a debate on this, whether state repression could be used against Islam or Christianity, if that's a viable, legal way. I mean, China is doing that, right? What does India want to become like China? These questions are there, but I'm glad you clarified Sitaramji's position on it, so that it's out there with the audience, and of course the people on YouTube who are watching this video. And that's what our objective in the series is. So once again, like, any more questions on prophetism today, or we should end it because we are already over time?
One comment I want to make is
Question.
The thing about Hindus are like white people in the West is the way West looks at Hindus in India as white supremacy in our white dominance in West. I don't think that is the case. The propaganda against Hinduism and propping up radical Islam is a Western deep state agenda. Because if you want to destroy a civilization or capture a civilization or convert a civilization, we have to strengthen the disruptive forces that destroys the civilization. Throughout the history, they will find those disruptive forces and prop them up so that once the civilization is weakened, it will be suitable to be converted. So I have to, with all due respect, I have to disagree on that part.
Okay. Well, you see, I find in India, and I sense it in your question too, a rather anachronistic view of the West. You see, they think that, I mean, the West has, of course, committed all kinds of aggression against other continents, against India. No doubt about it. There's been terrible exploitation by the British. There has been a great loss of life because of unconcern for these supposedly inferior Indians, like in the Bengal famine and so on. Okay, this is all true. But you see, there is something that often Indians don't understand, that is the phenomenon of change. You see, when I look at the mentality in the West today compared to the colonial age, well, I can assure you there is no such thing as a will to penetrate India, to dominate India, and so on. And so now I see many people getting incredulous, but that's simply a fact. Western countries are right now too wrapped up in the problems they themselves have, and they don't care for India. You see, that's, of course, you see, Hindus usually say about themselves that they have developed over the centuries an inferiority complex. But deep down, they still have a superiority complex, which dates back to the time that India was the shining jewel of the world. And so that's still there somewhat. And so in particular, it is here that Hindus think that everybody's concerned with India. Well, you see, I can tell you some news. Most people in the world don't care about India. And so they don't care to dominate India. They don't care to divide India. They don't care to break India. It's only certain specific forces that have these interests. So you have the Islamic world, you have the communists. You also indeed have churches, typically headquartered in the United States. And so they still pursue this. This does not mean that they want to break India. That totally depends on circumstances. They don't care for India. If India, was thrown into 20 pieces, they wouldn't mind if they could pick up those pieces. But India can stay united if they can conquer India. And so they well might. So you see, even those specific forces, like the headquarters of the churches, have nothing against India per se. There have been cases of Christian separatism in the Northeast in particular. At the time of partition, Some Christian masterminds in Kerala and so on thought of, okay, well then let's take our chance now and establish a few Christian states on Indian soil. So that has been there, that has gone quickly. And we see many Indian Christians proudly stand to attention when the national anthem is played and so on. They feel quite Indian, and they are confident that they can win the struggle in India. And so the Indian state and state structure and so on, that's no concern of theirs. What they are concerned with is that those same Indians get saved, you see, get Christianized, get baptized. And so the idea that the West wants to break India and so on, that's just a figment of the imagination, even economically. You see, India is a bit of a challenge to certain Western interests, on the same pattern as China is at the moment. And yet, you see, many people in the business world reason in the opposite sense. They say, well, the growth of India, the growth of China means that we can sell more, we can import better products. You see, there will be a worldwide competition that is ultimately good for everyone. And so even at that, at that level, there's no conspiracy against India. It's a figment of the imagination. And it is a form of self-flattery. It is giving India more importance than it has.
Yeah, we don't have time to discuss that, but I will send you the Tehalka paper on underground investigation. It was an excellent underground investigation, early 2000. It exposed a lot of the things, Christian missionary, how the State Department, CIA, and also, of course, the Rajiv Malhotra, the completely independent work. So they have exposed. When I say West, even West people are victims of deep state. But what I'm saying is the deep state uses different tools in different areas for conquest. In China, they may use a Hong Kong protest as a tool. In India, propping up radical forces like radical Islam, converting the country as a way to control, contain, and convert India. So they have different aspirations in different parts of the world, but at the end of the day, the Western deep state wants to grab and plunder the other nations. Even now, the pharma industry, what the pharma is doing to Western people, it is the same thing. But they do different things in different areas, and the West is not an exception for them. Anybody is a victim for them as long as they can plunder.
Well, you see, in that respect, and we can stop there, but you see, there is an important new development that America, which was on the side of Pakistan and supporting every possible breaking India force, now under Trump, but continuing under Biden, has changed camp, supports India, because now it needs India as a counterweight against China. And in Pakistan, the game is up. You see, America was a privileged partner, now it is China. America is still tolerated, but it's kept at a distance. Like Americans in Pakistan do not have the privileges that now the Chinese are acquiring. So, there is now a far more positive attitude towards India. That's also why I think that all the propaganda against Hinduism that is still produced in academia in the West, like with the recent dismantling Hindutva conference, that is less and less supported by the state. And so you will see that movement weakening. It's also weakening because of efforts of people, like, for instance, the Ghent school of Balagangadhara Rao, that is dismantling a number of the Western ideas, prejudices about the ugly, vicious Hindu caste system and so on. Even there, we see an evolution in the right direction because of a convergence of different factors, our own efforts, but also the fact that through, you see the coincidences of geopolitical evolutions, India is now suddenly among the good guys. So, I mean, Hinduism still faces serious problems, but that geopolitical problem is now much less.
This is sort of on the same line as I was saying, but nevertheless, I will stop here because the issue is not whether it is happening to Hinduism. Issue is one of the principle, whether it can happen to anyone and can any community. For example, Jews are not Hindus, but they face the Holocaust because of
of course, it is commendable that you say, we should look at a universal perspective. It doesn't only concern Hindus, it concerns everyone. That's the right approach, I think. But okay, I guess we have exhausted the subject for now.
Yes.
Namaste and good night.
Okay.
And good.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, namaste.
Thank you very next one is the next
Namaskar,
Monday.
Banerjee.
Yeah, next Monday. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.